Nebuchadnezzar did not lose his mind suddenly. He started losing it the moment he believed he was above everything. And that's what makes this story uncomfortable. Because when people think about Nebuchadnezzar, they usually remember the madness, the isolation, the strange behavior, the collapse. But the real collapse started much earlier. It started when success stopped feeling like a gift and started feeling like proof. By this point, Nebuchadnezzar was not simply a king. He was the most powerful man in the world. Babylon was enormous. Its walls were legendary. Its wealth was staggering. Its armies were feared. Its enemies were defeated. And almost everywhere he looked, there was another reminder of his own success. A palace, a monument, a conquered nation, a city carrying his fingerprints. The empire kept growing. The king kept winning. And after enough victories, something dangerous started happening. Nobody around him had much reason to tell him he was wrong. Which sounds great, right until it isn't. Because when someone spends years hearing yes, they eventually forget reality is allowed to answer no. Nebuchadnezzar was reaching that point, the point where confidence becomes certainty and certainty becomes blindness. The problem wasn't power. The problem was believing it came only from him. That was the shift. That was the crack in the foundation. Not visible, not dramatic, not yet, but it was there. Because success creates a strange illusion. The longer someone keeps winning, the easier it becomes to believe the rules no longer apply to them. Kings do it. Generals do it. CEOs do it. Entire companies have disappeared because somebody walked into a meeting convinced they were too successful to fail. History is surprisingly repetitive that way. Nebuchadnezzar was no exception. Every victory pushed him a little higher. Every achievement made him a little more certain. Every success made him a little less aware of his limits. And this is where success starts looking like intoxication. Not because success is bad, but because too much success can alter perception. It can make borrowed power feel permanent, temporary victories feel eternal, and personal ability feel limitless. Meanwhile, humility was becoming increasingly difficult to find. Humility level, archaeologically non-existent. The king probably didn't notice any of this. Most people don't. Ego rarely arrives announcing itself. It usually walks in disguised as confidence, then slowly takes over the building. Nebuchadnezzar kept ruling, kept building, kept expanding, kept collecting reasons to admire himself. And every new success reinforced the same dangerous idea, that everything he had existed because of him, that everything he built depended on him, that everything he ruled belonged to him. The empire looked stronger than ever. The king looked stronger than ever. Which is exactly why the warning that came next felt so strange, because it didn't arrive as an invasion. It didn't arrive as a rebellion. It didn't arrive as an enemy army. It arrived as a dream. And the dream would explain exactly how far the king was about to fall. The dream explained exactly what would happen. That was the uncomfortable part, because sometimes people imagine biblical warnings arriving as mysterious riddles nobody can understand. Nebuchadnezzar didn't get that version. He got clarity, a giant tree, strong, visible across the world, impossible to ignore, then suddenly cut down, not destroyed, not erased, but brought low. And before the king had time to wonder what it meant, Daniel explained everything, clearly, directly, without softening any of it. The tree was Nebuchadnezzar. The fall was Nebuchadnezzar. The warning was for Nebuchadnezzar. And unless something changed, the future was already moving toward him. There was no mystery, no confusion, no missing information. The king received the full report, which should have been enough, but that's where the real problem appeared. Because hearing a warning and believing a warning are two very different things. Nebuchadnezzar understood every word Daniel said. He simply struggled with one small detail, believing it could actually happen to him. And this is where warning turns into background noise, because some people don't ignore warnings because they fail to understand them. They ignore warnings because they secretly believe they're the exception. The warning applies to other people, other leaders, other companies, other kingdoms, other disasters, just not theirs. It's receiving a complete report about an approaching collapse and responding, "We'll monitor the situation," which sounds responsible. until the situation starts monitoring you. Daniel's message was not complicated. The king needed humility. The king needed perspective. The king needed to recognize that power wasn't self-created. For a moment, the warning felt real. For a moment, the king could see the danger. For a moment, he stood close enough to the edge to recognize the drop. But then, something happened. Nothing. The palace remained standing. The throne remained occupied. The empire remained powerful. The armies remained loyal. Days passed, weeks passed, months passed, and the longer nothing happened, the easier it became to believe nothing would happen. Because time creates a dangerous illusion. If the consequences don't arrive immediately, people start negotiating with reality. Maybe the warning wasn't that serious. Maybe the danger was exaggerated. Maybe the rules work differently for people like them. And that's usually when the trouble begins, because comfort has convinced more people to ignore reality than fear ever has. Nebuchadnezzar still remembered the dream. He still remembered Daniel. He still remembered the interpretation. But memory is not the same thing as change. Prophecy received successfully. Practical change indefinitely postponed. The danger was never a lack of warning. The danger was excessive confidence. Some people hear the warning, they just can't imagine it happening to them. And Nebuchadnezzar kept believing exactly that, right up until the day he stepped outside, looked across the empire he ruled, admired everything he had built, and finally spoke the sentence that turned the warning into reality. The warning did not fail, the king did, because eventually the day arrived when Nebuchadnezzar stepped outside, looked across Babylon, and saw exactly what he wanted to see: proof of himself. The city was magnificent, the walls were enormous, the palaces were dazzling. The empire stretched farther than most rulers could imagine. Everywhere he looked, there was another reminder of his success, another monument, another achievement, another reason to admire what he had built. And that's what made the next moment so dangerous. Nothing was going wrong. No invasion, no rebellion, no crisis, no emergency. Everything was working, which is often when pride becomes most convincing, because success has a way of making people forget how much help they received getting there. And eventually Nebuchadnezzar looked over Babylon and said the sentence that changed everything: "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built?" There it was. The sentence, the illusion. The destination he had been moving toward for years. Not gratitude, credit. Not stewardship, ownership. Not recognition of what had been given. Recognition only of himself. The problem wasn't the sentence. The problem was what the sentence revealed, because Nebuchadnezzar no longer saw himself as someone who had received power. He saw himself as the source of it. The empire existed because of him. The victories existed because of him. The greatness existed because of him. At least that's what he believed. The fall didn't begin in madness. It began in the need to place himself above everything. And this is where ego grows faster than the ability to remain human, because pride rarely introduces itself as pride. It usually arrives disguised as deserved recognition, then quietly expands until it occupies the entire building. Kings do it, founders do it, executives do it. Entire organizations have collapsed because somebody started believing success was entirely self-generated. History keeps recycling that lesson. Nebuchadnezzar was simply living through his version of it. Every victory reinforced the same story. Every achievement strengthened the same illusion. Every success pointed back to the same person. Himself. Self-credit, 100%. Contact with reality, increasingly unavailable. And the irony was already forming, because the dream had been clear. The warning had been clear. Daniel had been clear. Reality was finally catching up. The man who controlled an empire could no longer control his own mind. That is what made the collapse so shocking. Not because the warning was unexpected, but because the outcome felt impossible. Powerful people rarely imagine themselves falling. Successful people rarely imagine themselves failing. And proud people rarely imagine themselves being wrong. Yet everything had been moving toward this moment from the very beginning. The dream exposed it. The warning explained it. The sentence confirmed it. And before the words had fully settled into the air, the consequence that seemed impossible suddenly became unavoidable. Because the most powerful man in the world was about to discover that there are some things no empire can protect. The collapse was no longer a warning, it was reality. The dream had happened, the prediction had happened. The impossible had happened. Nebuchadnezzar lost control of his mind, and suddenly the most powerful man in the world became the most fragile. The king who once commanded armies could no longer command himself. The ruler who once shaped nations could no longer manage his own behavior. And the irony was impossible to miss, because the man who wanted to stand above everyone ended up living below everyone. The transformation shocked Babylon, but the real story wasn't the madness. The real story was what the madness exposed, because everything Nebuchadnezzar built was still standing. The walls were still there, the palaces were still there, the empire was still there. Babylon had not disappeared. Nebuchadnezzar's illusion had. And this is where false greatness finally falls apart, because the king had spent years believing the empire depended on him, years believing he was the source of its greatness, years believing he was indispensable. Then reality delivered a brutal correction. The empire kept moving. With him. Without him, it kept moving. Which is one of the most uncomfortable lessons power can teach. People often believe they are irreplaceable, right until everything continues functioning without them. Babylon still needed a king. Babylon simply did not need Nebuchadnezzar as much as Nebuchadnezzar thought. The throne survived. The government survived. The kingdom survived. The illusion did not. Some falls don't just take power, they take illusion. And that is exactly what was happening, because this was never just punishment, it was dismantling. A complete dismantling of false greatness. Piece by piece, layer by layer, every belief that told Nebuchadnezzar he was self-made was being stripped away. Not his walls, not his monuments, not his palaces, his illusion. The story he had told himself for years was collapsing. The story that said he was untouchable. The story that said success belonged entirely to him. The story that said he stood above ordinary limitations. Reality was removing that story, one painful piece at a time. Status, technically king. Functioning normally, highly questionable. And the irony kept growing, because the man who once appeared larger than life was now confronting something he had avoided for years. His own limits. No audience remained, no achievements remained, no victories remained, no empire remained to hide behind. Only reality. And for the first time in a very long time, reality was winning, because some collapses don't remove what you have. They remove what you think you are. And that's what made this moment so important. Not because Nebuchadnezzar had lost everything. Because he hadn't. The empire was still there, the throne was still there, the kingdom was still there. But after losing the illusion that made him believe he was greater than everyone else, he was finally approaching something he had not experienced in years. Perspective. And only after losing everything he thought made him great, could he finally begin to see. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar looked up, and for the first time in years, he saw clearly. Not because Babylon had changed, not because the empire had changed, not because reality had changed. He had. The king who once believed everything pointed back to him was finally forced to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. He was not the source. He never was. And that's what makes the ending so fascinating. Because the restoration didn't begin when he regained power. It began when he regained perspective. For most of the story, Nebuchadnezzar had been climbing. More victories, more influence, more success, more reasons to admire himself. Then came the dream. Then came the warning. Then came the sentence. Then came the collapse. And only after everything else failed did understanding arrive. Because sometimes people don't change when they're informed. They change when their illusion stops working. Nebuchadnezzar finally recognized something he had forgotten long ago. Power has limits. Success has limits. Human beings have limits. And this is where perspective becomes stronger than pride. Because the real lesson was never about losing a kingdom. He didn't lose the kingdom. The kingdom survived, the empire survived, Babylon survived. The real loss happened much earlier. The real loss was human. The real loss was spiritual. The real loss was believing he stood above everyone else. Because once someone starts seeing themselves as the source of everything, reality eventually disagrees. The pattern never changes. Kings discover it, empires discover it, companies discover it, entire civilizations discover it. Success is rarely what destroys people. The illusion created by success often does. Nebuchadnezzar learned that lesson the hard way. Empire restored, perspective restored, ego significantly reduced. And that's what makes the ending so ironic. The man who once ruled the greatest empire on earth finally understood his own size only after losing everything he thought made him great. The warning had been correct. The dream had been correct. Daniel had been correct. Reality had been correct. The only thing that had been wrong was the king's understanding of himself. For years he believed power proved he could not fall. For years he believed success proved he was different. For years he believed greatness made him untouchable. But history has always been ruthless with that belief, because nobody becomes immune to reality. Not kings, not rulers, not conquerors, not anyone. And that's why Nebuchadnezzar's story still feels surprisingly modern. Because the danger was never power itself. The danger was believing power placed him above the rules that govern everyone else. Nebuchadnezzar didn't lose his mind because he had power. He lost his mind because he started believing he could never fall.